What is the scariest you have seen in person? Story 1. A full-grown grizzly bear slammed into a window right next to me, snarling and pawing at the glass, trying to get in. It was the night shift on a remote mine site, which meant it was completely dark outside. The bear seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I was the only person in the building at the time, with my nearest co-worker being up a large hill and deep inside the ore mill. I screamed in pure terror, grabbed my radio and hid under a lab bench like I thought 2 inches of plastic would somehow save me. My radio call went something like, "Emergency, emergency, emergency. There is a bear down here. Someone, please come now. Emergency, emergency." By the time a team of bear hazers finally made it down, the animal had disappeared. All that was left were its claw marks on the glass, some fresh bear droppings outside, and me flat out refusing to come out from under my titration setup. Good times. Story 2. I was a child when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, give or take 5, I had this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window on the passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Do not!" I froze completely. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest, then completely stopped when I heard a tapping sound on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I did not know what was happening and thought it was over until our truck suddenly dipped in the back. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me," and "Do not turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tapping, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around inside. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to say a prayer in the morning so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat, just staring at the radio and watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer until we arrived at my grandmother's house. To this day, my uncle has never spoken about it again. Story 3. I was in high school at a friend's house party. My girlfriend had gotten extremely drunk while I was barely buzzed and struggling to enjoy myself. She wouldn't stop insisting on being close, even though I just wanted her to rest. She kept pushing, and no matter how many times I tried to say no, she wouldn't listen. Eventually, we went upstairs into a bedroom. She turned off the lights, pulled me down, and kept insisting things would be fun. I felt cornered and overwhelmed by how forceful she was being. The whole time, it didn't feel right to me. I wasn't enjoying it, and instead of feeling connected, I felt uncomfortable, pressured and trapped in a moment I didn't want. The friction was too much, I was not feeling it, and I was about to ask her to stop. Suddenly, she made a strange noise, like a mix between a cough and a hiccup. I asked, "Are you all right?" And then, without warning, she completely lost control. In that moment, everything went wrong, and I found myself in an awful, humiliating situation in my friend's little brother's room. It was traumatizing, and to this day, it remains one of the most disturbing experiences I have ever had. Story 4. About 2 years ago, a surfer hit his head on a sandbar and was knocked unconscious. I was the closest one to him in the water. By the time I reached him, his heart had stopped and his skin had turned purple. I pulled him in with help from another teenager who had been surfing with him but had gone into shore earlier and then come back out once my parents realized what was happening. An emergency room technician and a former lifeguard began CPR on him, breaking ribs in the process. Eventually, they revived him, and he began to wail in pain. It was by far the most horrible sound I had ever heard, a blood-curdling mix of sobbing and cries of agony. It still disturbs me when I think about it. Thankfully, he has now made a great recovery and regained about 95% of his nervous system function that had been damaged by the impact. For reference, he had been so discolored that his own nephew did not recognize him for about 15 minutes. Story 5. I once witnessed my mom get attacked by our dog. We were standing in the dining room talking when our family dog, a Shiba Inu named Zeus, dropped a toy at her feet. She threw the toy for him a few times. Zeus ran after it, tackled it, and brought it back. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. We had finished our conversation, and I was walking away. Zeus strutted past me with the toy in his mouth on his way back to drop it at her feet when she got down on the floor to play with him. Something about seeing her on all fours with the toy between them suddenly set him off, and he lunged with the loudest, scariest growl I had ever heard. The whole thing lasted maybe a minute at most. I had just rounded the corner when I whipped back to see my mom standing up, her face covered in blood. The only thing visible were her eyes. Her bottom lip was barely attached, just hanging from her face, and her nose was split 3 ways. There was blood everywhere. She was cupping her hand under her chin to catch it as she walked to the bathroom. She stood over the sink, letting the blood drip in, and cried into the mirror. I yelled to ask if I should call an ambulance, and she just nodded. I think we were both in shock. The dog weighed maybe 20 pounds, just a little fluff, with a curly tail, and usually a cuddle muffin. But that day he practically tore her face apart. The ambulance came and took her. I put the dog outside on the run. He seemed ashamed at that point, not aggressive anymore, just sitting on the step with his head down. That was the last time I saw him. At the hospital, she needed a huge number of stitches. She stayed in denial, blaming herself for being on the floor and saying, "He was just being a dog. He thought I was going to take his toy. It won't happen again." She begged them not to take the dog, but he had to be put down the next day. It was a terrifying and horrible series of events. That dog had always been nice, barked a lot, but otherwise a good family pet. Just one moment, one snap, and it was over. Still to this day, it is the scariest thing I have ever witnessed firsthand. Story 6. I had just turned 22 when my parents sold their house and bought a place out in the country. On the property, there was a big shed not far from the house, which I decided to turn into my place. I sometimes felt uncomfortable in the shed, but my dog kept me company, so it was not too bad. I had been living there for maybe 2 weeks when one night I was on the computer with my dog asleep at my feet. I needed to use the bathroom, so I stepped outside. It was a beautiful, clear night, and the stars were incredible. Suddenly, I heard the shed door slam shut behind me. I turned immediately and tried to open it, but it would not budge. From inside, I heard my dog start to growl, quietly at first, then louder. Soon he was barking, and I was panicking while trying to force the door open. I should mention that I am 6'5", well-built, and play sports, but even ramming my full weight into the door would not open it. My panic grew as my dog's barks turned to whines, then whimpering, and finally silence. With all my strength, I slammed into the door and it finally flew open. The light inside was off now, leaving it pitch black. I tried the switch, but it would not turn back on. I stumbled around in the darkness, trying to find a flashlight. When I finally found it and turned it on, I was not prepared for what I saw next. My dog had squeezed himself into the farthest, darkest corner of the shed. His eyes were shut tight and his body was shaking violently. I rushed toward him, and the moment I got close, he leapt into my arms and refused to move. I picked him up and ran faster than I ever had in my life. I never stepped foot in that shed again, and my dog refused to go near that part of the property. I still do not know what happened in there that night, but I will never forget it. Story 7. This happened about 3 years ago on a Friday night with an old friend of mine. He was a heavy smoker and convinced me to join him in his backyard. After about 20 to 30 minutes of laughing and drinking soda, we decided to go down the street to meet his mother at what he said was a family friend's house. It was around 12 o'clock at night, and as we walked, a police car suddenly pulled out from a dark dirt road next to us. The officer stepped out and started asking us questions. Around the 9th or 10th question, a man in a white tank top and blue jeans came running out of a nearby house yelling, "Hey, what are you doing?" He began arguing with the officer, insisting we were his kids, and the officer had no reason to stop us. After what felt like forever, the officer finally stopped questioning us and let us leave with this man. My friend knew him and looked relieved, as if we had been saved. As we approached the house just 10 feet from the door, the man pulled a rusty hatchet from behind his jeans and said, "He'll meet us inside," before disappearing behind the house. Once inside, it was nearly pitch black. My friend and I found a couch to sit on. His mother entered and greeted us, while my friend started telling her about what had just happened with the officer. Then the man came back through the back door, looking agitated, and began rummaging through a drawer filled with old tools until he pulled out a small cylinder-shaped pipe. He handed it to my friend, and after some chatter about a so-called great white buffalo, the pipe was passed to me. It had a small black figure of Bart Simpson with the words El Barto written underneath. The man's energy grew more erratic, and I began to feel increasingly uneasy. It was raining heavily, and when I looked out a small window, I noticed the same police car parked on the dirt road a few houses down. Walking home was not an option, so I frantically texted another friend to come get me immediately. An hour later, he arrived. I nudged my friend and got up to leave quickly. Just as I headed toward the door, the man blocked my path, smiling. Then his smile vanished as he raised his left hand, spreading his fingers as if preparing to put on a glove, and with his other hand, he pulled a serrated knife from his back pocket. He leaned in and said, "If you tell anyone where I live or what I am doing here, I will cut off each and every one of your fingers, okay?" I nodded. He smiled again and stepped aside. The moment I stepped onto the concrete outside, I felt a wave of relief and gratitude to be alive. Story 8. This might not be as frightening as some other stories, but someone tried to break into my house while I was home. What scared me most was that I had locked the door he targeted just 5 minutes before it all happened. To add some detail, I wasn't even supposed to be home that day. I had skipped class for no particular reason and was playing on my Xbox 360 when I saw a silver Buick pull into the driveway. From my room, I could only see cars arrive, not where they parked, so I walked to my brother's room to get a better look. People came by often, so another car wasn't unusual, but I still kept an eye on it. The man rang the doorbell twice. I ignored it and went back toward my room, but something told me to lock the deadbolt on the French doors at the back of the house. A few minutes later, the car still hadn't left, which struck me as strange. I thought maybe it was someone like Jehovah's Witnesses, sitting in their car getting pamphlets ready. I went back to my game, but then I heard a scratching noise at the French doors. Since our cats stay outdoors, I knew it wasn't them. The sound continued, so I went to check. As I rounded the corner into the dining room, I saw him, a thin man in his 30s, prying at the door. I was confused, but instantly shouted and clapped my hands loudly. "What are you doing?" I treated him like a stray animal that had wandered up. He looked startled. Clearly, he thought no one was home, despite 2 cars being in the driveway. He bolted immediately. Instead of calling the police right away, I called my dad, who reminded me to report it. The intruder was never caught, but I still think about what might have happened if I had gone to school that day, or worse, if I had left that door unlocked. Story 9. I was sitting on a blanket with friends outside of a venue where Tyler, the Creator, was playing during South by Southwest. We had no hope of getting in, so we were just going to enjoy the music from a distance. People were lining up in the middle of the street because, allegedly, Tyler was going to pick 100 more fans to come inside. So I stood up and walked down to the sidewalk, not intending to stand in line, just to watch what was happening. I heard the engine before I saw the car. Then suddenly there was screaming, a flash of silver, and a car was plowing through the crowd. The people who had been standing in front of me just a second before were suddenly in the air or running away. The sound it made was the worst part. The heavy thuds of bodies hitting metal and a strange cracking sound like plastic breaking. They looked like rag dolls. People were either lying on the ground in the street or running in panic. I remember noticing a man right in front of me with reddish blonde hair, a beard, tawny-colored pants, and a black shirt. I had even thought he looked attractive before it all happened. Then suddenly he was on the pavement, his shoulder looking horribly broken, his face twisted in pain, until eventually he went unconscious, with blood pooling beneath him. I could not think about anything except how surreal it all was. I kept imagining what it must have been like to be the person in that car, seeing all those bodies, each one an individual with a life, hopes, dreams, and a personality, tumbling over the windshield. Some people were rushing to help the injured, while many others, including myself, were frozen in shock with our hands over our mouths. A staff member told me to go to an officer and get a ride home, but the person I was with had a car, so I left less than 10 minutes after it happened. I never talked to a professional about it, not even to my parents. I never felt like it would help. I still think about it every day, though most of the time I feel numb. Sometimes I get really bad anxiety when driving, or when I get too high. A couple of weeks later, I was walking along 6th Street in Austin when it was very crowded, and someone revved their engine, and I completely broke down. I was crying and panicking uncontrollably. Even now, it does not affect my life constantly, but I hate seeing news about it. Still, I find myself reading about the victims, and I even tried to search for the man who had been standing right in front of me that night, just to know if he ever recovered. Story 10. The scariest things I have ever experienced all happened within about 40 minutes, each one worse than the last. Back in October of the year 2012, I was involved in a three-car accident. My girlfriend and I had decided to go out late at night to get donuts. I pulled onto the street and stopped at an empty intersection. Since it was so late and there was no traffic, I thought I had a second to take out my chocolate milk for the ride home. The moment I pulled it out of the bag, I heard the screech of tires and a massive crash. I barely had time to look before I saw the most terrifying sight of my life: a 2.5-ton truck flying straight at me. In those brief seconds before impact, I realized three things. First, there had been a terrible accident that I was about to be a part of. Second, the truck, weighing thousands of pounds, was not even fully touching the ground as it came toward me. And third, there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. The truck slammed into my car. I had only enough time to close my eyes and let out a small sound before I felt someone touching my face and telling me it was okay. When I opened my eyes, it was my girlfriend. Miraculously, I was alive and unhurt, though our car had been shoved 3 lanes over. The driver's side was crushed right up against me, but somehow I had no injuries. We climbed out through the passenger side and saw the full destruction. My car was badly damaged, but the other 2 trucks were in shambles. I ran to the one that had hit me and found a young man screaming that he could not breathe and that his ribs were broken. I checked him carefully. He was hurting but not dying. So I had my girlfriend comfort him while I went to the 3rd truck, the one that had caused it all. As I approached, I heard screams I will never forget. They were not normal screams of pain. They were screams of sheer suffering, filled with terror. When I reached the vehicle, I saw a girl who had already passed away and another person screaming in horror beside her. A boy was lying in the road next to the truck in a pool of his own blood. My knees went weak and darkness closed in at the edges of my vision, but I forced myself to breathe. Then I heard someone behind me ask, "What is in the street?" I turned and saw a small white bundle in the middle of the intersection. My heart sank. I knew immediately it was a baby. Without hesitation, I ran toward it. Wrapped in the blanket, the child was motionless. I reached down, prepared for the worst moment of my life. As I gently picked up the baby, there was no movement, no sound. Then suddenly a small wiggle, still silent but alive. Relief surged through me as I uncovered the baby's face. Despite a cut on his forehead, he was beautiful, and I will never forget that sight. It was hope in the middle of horror. There had been another baby ejected from the same truck in worse condition, but she made a full recovery. Even now, years later, I cannot shake the details of that night. It still drains me to remember. Story 11. About 3 months ago, I was walking home around 9 o'clock in the evening. It was dark, but not very late, and I was just minding my own business when I noticed a man coming toward me in the distance. Even from far away, there was something odd about his face, though I could not tell exactly what it was. As he came closer, I suddenly realized he was wearing a clown mask. Clown masks are unsettling in general, but this one was especially disturbing, with exaggerated and twisted features that made it even worse. Seeing that mask in the dark, on a quiet street, made my heart drop. I kept walking, doing my best to ignore him, and thankfully he just passed by without saying a word. What unsettled me even more was that it was not Halloween, not even close to the holiday, so I had no idea why he would be wearing something like that. Maybe he had come from a party, but I will never know. All I know is that seeing that clown mask out of nowhere in the dark scared me more than I could have imagined. Story 12. It was New Year's Eve, and after a wild night of kisses and body shots, I was completely drained. I crawled into my buddy's bed, alone, at maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and had the best 20-minute sleep of my life. I woke up to the sound of a constant thumping and cracking noise. Every few seconds there was a thump, then silence. I slowly got out of bed and crept across the room. The plan had been that only me and him would stay over, but when I looked around, I noticed a few people sleeping on couches, in the bathtub, or just lying on the floor. Still, nothing seemed out of place. I couldn't find the source of the noise until I went downstairs to the basement. I placed my hand on the wall's corner and realized the thumping was coming from inside the wall. I stepped back a few inches, staring at it, when suddenly the tip of an axe broke straight through. I screamed, and within seconds my friend came rushing down the stairs. I froze against the opposite wall as he burst through the door. He saw the axe push back through the wall and crash in again, sending splinters flying. Grabbing a shovel, he pulled me out the back door, and together we ran around the house to confront whoever was swinging the axe. What we found was the axe, firmly stuck in the side of the house, with nobody around. We circled the house several times, but there was no sign of anyone. It remains the most terrifying experience I've ever had. That axe is still in his basement, locked inside a footlocker, waiting for its owner to return. Story 13. When I was 14, I was walking to the Walgreens a few blocks from my house. I wore a yellow fleece hoodie because it was chilly, along with dark blue jeans. As I waited to cross the street, a van pulled into the turn lane. The driver yelled something, and when I looked up, he started flashing gang signs at me. I glanced around to see if he was signaling someone else, but it was definitely meant for me. Then he flashed the end of a gun, and I almost lost it. I abandoned my plan to go to Walgreens and immediately turned toward the McDonald's and grocery store down the road, hoping to get closer to where people were. The driver aggressively pulled a U-turn, screeching his tires and even jumping the curb behind me. I kept my head down and avoided eye contact, praying they would drive on. As they passed, the passenger yelled, "Little coward!" I was terrified for my life. Once they were a couple of blocks away, I turned and ran all the way home. I had lived in that neighborhood for most of my life and had never experienced anything like that before, nor have I since. Story 14. When I was 17, I used to street race on Saturday nights with some friends and classmates who had fast cars. We had a loop we used from time to time, about 1.6 miles long, circling the local armory. We only raced when there was no military drill scheduled there. The loop included a half-mile straight stretch that served as the start and finish line, followed by a sharp 100-degree turn back to the left, where a 6-foot curb ran along the outside edge. One night, my close friend, let's call him Jay, was racing in his 1969 Dodge Charger RT while I was in my 1976 Ford Mustang Cobra II. We were pacing each other at around 85 miles per hour, braking down to about 40 at the turn. Jay swung a little wide, and to avoid hitting him, I braked harder, losing momentum and falling about 5 car lengths behind. As we came back around to the long straight, we both pushed our speeds up to around 100 miles per hour. That was when Jay made the turn without slowing down. I saw his wheels cut hard left, smoke rising from the tires, his car tilted at about 30 degrees, then slam into the curb with the right front tire first. The back of the car lifted into the air, and then the whole vehicle went airborne. It rolled 15 to 20 times, tearing itself apart. The driver's side door ripped off and flew into the night. I swear I saw him looking at me and screaming as the car flipped. His Charger landed upside down in a dry creek bed at the bottom of a ravine. I slammed my brakes, jumped out as soon as my car stopped, and ran toward him. But as I reached the drop-off, the gas tank ruptured and exploded, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the sky. I collapsed to my knees as the screams echoed. I do not know if they were his or mine. Our friends, including his sister, who was 12 at the time, rushed over when they saw the fireball. They later told me they found me collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. The police arrived and we explained what had happened. We were charged with trespassing, and I was also charged with reckless driving and reckless endangerment until the police chief realized how devastated I was and dropped the charges. Investigators determined that a blown seal in Jay's master cylinder had caused his brakes to fail. I still own the Mustang, and it sits in my garage exactly as it was that night. I sometimes start it and sit inside, but I have never been able to drive it again. I also keep what remains of Jay's Charger in my garage. When I was 20, a friend told me the police planned to scrap it if no one claimed it, so I pulled some favors at the junkyard and had it hauled to my house, where it has stayed ever since. Even decades later, in my 50s now, I still break down when I think of it. Jay's sister forgave me eventually, but his father still threatens me whenever he sees me, and his mother cries when our paths cross. To this day, I send them money anonymously each month, disguised as a prize from a fake sweepstakes, just trying to give back in some way. Story 15. My mom had cancer and underwent far too much radiation. My dad also kept some of her medical issues from me and my sisters, so I can't be very specific about everything that happened. She had already been through multiple surgeries and heavy radiation. It was her third or fourth time battling cancer. A hole began forming under her chin. She originally had cancer of the mouth and tongue, and something kept eating away at her flesh, making the hole grow larger and larger. A few months before she passed away, the hole had become so big that you could see bone and raw tissue whenever she cleaned her bandage. She did it all herself. She was the strongest person I have ever known. She smelled of infection and decay, and helping her clean that wound as a teenager of 15 or 16 years old was one of the hardest things I have ever done. A week before she died, while she was bedridden and in a comatose state, something inside gave way and a large amount of old blood, or at least what I was told was blood, though it was dark green, gushed out of the decayed opening and all over her body. Words cannot describe how horrifying that moment was. I wish I knew more details, accurate details, but I may never know. I was young for much of her illness, and I've blocked out much of what I do remember. My parents never told me or my sisters the truth about her illness, trying to shelter us. On top of that, my dad was abusive, and I have since cut contact with him. Story 16. I have never spoken about this before, but once I witnessed a murder as it happened from beginning to end. It was back in the year 2008 in my hometown of Tijuana, Mexico. It was late, around 10 o'clock at night after a long day at college. I was in a shared taxi with other passengers, just a few minutes from home, waiting at a red light. There was a taco stand about 20 meters to our right, with a man working, cleaning, and preparing food. A car pulled up, and two men got out and ordered tacos. Suddenly, a navy blue Ford Focus, with California plates, almost certainly stolen, blew through the red light right in front of us and stopped at the stand. Two men jumped out and immediately started shooting at the two customers who had just arrived. I will never forget the sound of the gunshots, the smell, and the sight of their bodies collapsing to the ground. The taxi driver floored it, trying to get us out of there. But as we drove away, we heard the bursts of automatic gunfire as they finished them off. The most heartbreaking part was that the taco vendor, who had done nothing but work, was also killed. That year, my city was in the middle of a brutal war between drug cartels. That night, I saw 3 people die right in front of me, and I was completely terrified. Story 17. When I was about 6 years old, I was visiting my dad at his cottage, where I stayed every summer. There were 2 houses on the property, the main house where my grandparents lived year-round, and the guest house where my dad and I stayed. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night in the guest house. I was afraid of the dark and couldn't get back to sleep, so I went looking for my dad. The house was small, but I couldn't find him anywhere. Thinking maybe he had gone outside to use the bathroom, I stepped through the main door and then the screen door and called for him, but got no answer. I walked down the steps toward the large open field. On either side of the house, there were about 40 yards. One side had neighbors, the other led to a forest. I walked about 20 feet from the house when a tingling sensation went down my spine. I turned around and saw a wolf coming toward me from the tree line. Terrified, I sprinted back to the house, fumbling with the screen door, which felt like it took forever to open. Once inside, I turned and saw how close the wolf had come. It was standing at the bottom of the steps, staring at me as if I was its next meal. I slammed the main door shut so hard that I woke my dad, who had been sleeping on the floor because the couch was too small and uncomfortable. Story 18. I am a police officer, and one night I was dispatched around 1 o'clock in the morning to check out a prowler. The residents reported seeing 2 people wearing masks in the yard across the street. One had a hockey mask like the character Jason. I don't remember the other. It was about 2 weeks after Halloween, so it sounded somewhat plausible. When we arrived, we spoke to the residents, who seemed sober and sane, not like the occasional calls we get from people high or hallucinating. We searched the area and found nothing, then cleared the call. About an hour later, we were called back. This time, dispatch stayed on the phone with the residents while 5 of us surrounded the area. Dispatch relayed that the residents could still see the 2 prowlers in the next yard. We moved in, and then dispatch said the prowlers had waved, put their fingers to their lips to shush, and moved into the shed. The problem was, I was right next to that shed. I gave loud verbal commands, banged on the door, and got no response. Finally, I opened the shed, completely empty. I even checked for a trap door, but the shed was raised only about 4 inches off the ground, with no exit. We checked the entire area again, and there was nothing. Talking to the residents afterward, they insisted they had clearly seen the two men wave and walk into the shed at the exact moment I was standing beside it. They had no history of making false calls. We tried every possible explanation and came up with nothing. I am not much of a believer in the paranormal, but that night left me with no logical explanation for what I experienced. Story 19. When I was around 14, my hockey team had an out-of-town tournament. Between games, we had a lot of spare time, so some of my teammates and I wandered through the woods. It was the middle of winter, snow everywhere, and we would just hike around for fun. One time we walked out onto a big frozen lake. We started daring each other. One guy would go some distance, then the next would go a little further. Nobody wanted to be the first to back out. We got about 50 meters, roughly 150 feet, from the shore. That was when the ice began to crack. It didn't sound like you'd expect. It was more of a low groan, something you felt deep in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. Under our feet, the ice vibrated and shook, like the feeling of a subway rumbling under the pavement, but louder, much louder. I don't remember the name of the teammate next to me, but I'll never forget the look of sheer terror in his eyes. Growing up in Canada, we were taught that falling through ice meant death. I remembered being told to spread my weight to stay safe, but in that moment, instinct told me to get off the lake. I started doing the slide shuffle you do when skating on thin ice. But when the groaning sound came again, I panicked and sprinted toward shore. Amazingly, all of us made it back without slipping through. Once on solid ground, I turned and saw the long cracks etched in the snow where the ice had split. To this day, I don't think I've ever felt more terrified. Story 20. I lived in Cairo, Egypt from 2002 to 2003 for about a year and a half. One night, 3 of us were heading to a friend's flat in Mohandassine. Finding parking was hard enough, but eventually we did. And as we got out of the car, we noticed a commotion about a block away at a busy intersection. Probably a car accident or a street fight, which were often the same thing. We entered the lobby of the building, passed through the secure front doors, and pressed the elevator button. Suddenly, a man burst through the entrance, holding another man in a chokehold. He threw the man to the ground, the door slammed behind him, and he began shouting at the one he had dropped. I couldn't understand their words. My Arabic wasn't good enough, but it was clearly not friendly. The man on the ground yelled something back, and then the attacker pulled out a black pistol and began savagely beating him over the head with it. I froze in shock, but then blurted out, "Enough, mother—" Without realizing it, I had shouted the single worst insult you can throw at someone in Egyptian Arabic, as it translates literally to an insult about a man's mother. The man turned immediately, eyes wide, the gun now pointed directly at my head from just a few meters away. He repeated the word in broken English, "Muzzer, F." My 2 Egyptian friends immediately stepped in between us, shielding me and explaining quickly that the phrase in English didn't carry the same meaning in Arabic, that I hadn't meant to offend him that way, and that I was just overwhelmed by what I saw. They begged for calm, saying I did not have a death wish, and convinced him to let me live. They motioned for me to go upstairs, and I took the elevator up to safety. A few minutes later, they joined me and explained what had actually been happening. The man with the gun was some kind of mafioso, and the man on the ground had robbed his mother at knife point earlier that same day. The pistol whipping was payback. I had almost become collateral damage. To this day, I still consider myself the luckiest man I know. Story 21. Being attacked by a dog is one of the scariest things that can happen. A few years ago, we took my dog to an off-leash park. Things were normal at first until an Australian shepherd suddenly treated my small sheepoo like a toy. It grabbed him by the back leg and started shaking him violently. My dog was yelping and bleeding, while the owner of the shepherd insisted her dog was just playing. I was 100% sure I was about to watch my dog die. Somehow my dog managed to wriggle free, and when the shepherd lunged again, I reacted without thinking. I kicked the shepherd in the face as hard as I could, terrified but desperate. I scooped my dog up and tossed him gently to my mom, who was sobbing and screaming at the owner. The shepherd wasn't done. It lunged once more, this time grabbing my arm and shaking me like prey. I fell into the snow and mud, trying to pry its jaws off my arm with my free hand and foot. Finally, it let go. I pulled up my sleeve, blood soaking through, the bite marks clear on my skin. The woman suddenly panicked, grabbed her dog, and fled. I sprinted after her just long enough to get a picture of her license plate. The police later told us the dog had a violent history. It had killed another dog weeks earlier and had attacked 2 people before. The woman and her dog were permanently banned from the park. My dog survived, though he was left skittish and fearful. He had once been a therapy dog, calm and gentle with everyone, but now he shies away from other dogs. I love animals deeply, and I never thought I could hurt one. I don't regret what I did to save my dog's life, but I still carry the weight of that day. Story 22. When I was 16, my grandmother had a seizure. My dad shook me and my sister awake at 3 in the morning, urging us to get up quickly. We ran to the kitchen, where my grandmother and my mom were. She looked so small and fragile, unable to hold her own weight, vomiting blood, and losing control of her body. Because of my mom's former line of work, we reacted calmly despite the horror. I called 911 and led the paramedics up to our apartment. My sister helped my mom comfort my grandmother while my dad carried her. It lasted 3 days. She had 2 seizures in those 3 days. Since my parents did not speak English well, I, as a Mexican teenager, had to stay in the hospital with them to translate everything. My mom and I probably slept no more than 4 hours total. The scariest part was watching the seizures and seeing her suffer like that. She had always been so lively despite her age, always dancing, singing, and leaping with excitement. It was just 5 days after her 89th birthday and 14 days before mine. To see the woman who had cared for me since I was born suffer so intensely in such a short time was heartbreaking and terrifying. My mom has never been the same since, and I still cannot sleep well at night. I know others may have faced worse situations, but for me, that was the scariest thing that ever happened. Story 23. My mom and I were outside playing catch with the dog. I decided to practice batting and hit a few balls into the field behind our house. The first few swings went fine, and the dog loved chasing after the balls. I did not notice that she kept inching closer with every swing. As I wound up for another hit, she suddenly jumped forward at the last second. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her move, but it was too late. The bat connected with her head. The sickening crack was followed by her yelp. I looked down in shock and saw blood coming from her snout and foam at her mouth. At 17 years old, I stood there crying, sure that I had just killed her. My mom rushed her to the vet, and 10 to 15 minutes later, she called me. Miraculously, there were no serious injuries. My dog had convulsed from head trauma and shock, but the blood was only from biting her tongue. Nothing permanent was damaged. Still, the memory of her lying on the ground, bleeding and convulsing, haunts me. Since then, anytime I see someone swinging a stick around an animal, I panic. Never in my life have I hated myself so much or felt so terrified. Story 24. It was March 26th, 2012. We were returning to base after a meeting with the local governor. Everything seemed normal. We stopped at some shops in the market, even bought fresh bread, then continued down the road. The base was only about 150 meters away. A child, maybe 10 to 12 years old, dressed all in white, walked along the wall beside our formation. He hopped a ditch and stepped into the street. In an instant, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, dirt and debris rained down. White smoke filled the air. My ears rang, and my mouth felt numb. Slowly, the screams broke through. I rolled over and realized some of the dirt sticking to me was not dirt. It was human flesh and bone. I wiped my arms, leaving bloody streaks. The smell of phosphorus and burnt hair filled the air. Around me were fragments of skull, a scalp, a small leg with skin peeled back and broken at the ankle. The screams grew louder. Someone shouted, "Corpman!" Over and over. A 10-year-old suicide bomber had detonated himself in the middle of our patrol. For the next 4 weeks, I had to relive it as we reviewed helmet camera footage. Over and over to analyze the attack and learn from it. The screams, the smell, the sight of flesh falling from the sky. They have stayed with me every single day since. Story 25. When I was 9, I lived near a busy road. It was December 24th, and my family was eating dinner when we heard a terrible crash. We rushed outside and saw a car smashed into a light post. There was no driver in sight, no passengers either, just neighbors coming out of their houses. Someone called the police while others looked for the driver. One person checked the car for documents and opened the trunk. People screamed and ran away. Inside was the owner of the car, his arms and legs bound, a bullet wound in his forehead. The police arrived soon after and cleared the area. Going back in to finish dinner felt unreal. Later, the news confirmed it was the owner in the trunk. A couple of years later, when I was almost 11, I woke up at night for a glass of water and found my stepdad collapsed on the kitchen floor. I woke my mom, and she took him to bed, telling me to go back to sleep. In the morning, as I was about to head to school, a paramedic stopped me from going downstairs. My stepdad had died of a heart attack. I was the one who found him. Story 26. 5 years ago, I was sitting in my bedroom when I heard a car tearing down the country road behind my house. It was loud, clearly going way too fast. I thought to myself, I hope they crash. Seconds later, I heard what sounded like an explosion. I ran to the window but saw nothing. I quickly put on shoes, jumped the fence, and ran down the road. At the sharp 45-degree corner, I saw where the car had gone straight instead of turning. It launched over a grass mound and into the second floor of a house. By the time I arrived, neighbors were gathered, stunned. The family inside thought they had survived a gas explosion. Their teenage daughter, who had been in her upstairs bedroom, narrowly escaped being crushed. I saw them hugging her, all of them in shock. I realized immediately that a car was buried inside the house and falling bricks made it too dangerous to approach. Just as I was about to attempt something reckless to help, the first responder arrived and took charge. Within minutes, police and emergency vehicles flooded the scene, about 30 in total. Eventually, it was announced that all 3 men inside the car had died on impact. They were believed to be under the influence and involved with drugs. To this day, I still remember the sound of that crash and the image of the house with a car lodged in its second floor. Story 27. When I was about 4 years old, my mom ran a daycare out of our house. She mostly babysat kids before and after school, and since I didn't go to preschool, I got to spend my days at home with her. One day, the only other child there was a boy around a year old. He was napping, so my mom decided to take a quick shower. I was in the living room playing when I heard her get out of the shower. She put on a bathrobe and went to check on the baby, and suddenly she bolted out of the room with him in her arms, yelling for me to get her the phone. She swept everything off one side of the dining room table and laid him down, starting mouth to mouth immediately. I handed her the phone, thankfully one of those old corded ones that could stretch across rooms, and she called 911. I still remember her words. I need an ambulance at address right now. He's not breathing. He's a year old and he's not breathing. The operator kept asking questions, but my mom was balancing the phone between her cheek and shoulder, giving him breath between talking. Finally, she screamed, "He's not breathing! Send someone now!" and dropped the phone. I stood right next to the table staring at him, his face blue. I thought he was dead. At that age, I already knew what death meant. One of my cousins my age had just died in a car accident because her father, high on hero, strapped the baby sister in a car seat, but put the 4-year-old in the front. When he rear-ended another car, his daughter was strangled by her seatbelt. She was one of my closest friends, so I already knew that kids could die suddenly and horribly. Within minutes, an ambulance and fire truck arrived. EMS filled the house and worked on him right on our table. My mom and a firefighter reassured me he was still alive. That's when I broke down crying, both from fear and relief. My mom carried me to her room to call his mom. She arrived within minutes, frantic, but by then her son was breathing again. She thanked my mom for saving him before leaving with the ambulance. I was still sobbing, so a firefighter sat me on the table and showed me the tools he carried, while my mom stepped into her room and cried privately. Later, she admitted to me that if she had waited even one more minute to check on him, he would have died or been brain damaged. He was diagnosed with sleep apnea and had to wear an alarm afterward that would wake him if he stopped breathing. Many years later, his mom reconnected with mine on Facebook and shared prom photos of him. 6'3", grown, healthy, and happy. I'm so grateful he survived. It remains one of the scariest things I ever witnessed. Story 28. This happened a few years back. It was just a normal morning with me and my mom getting ready when there was a knock at the door. My mom opened it to see our neighbor's brother-in-law. His wife had died of cancer a few years earlier, and it had devastated him. The brother-in-law asked if we had a spare key for the house because he couldn't reach him and was worried. Mom handed over the key. Not even 3 minutes later, he was pounding on our door, crying and screaming for help. My mom panicked, saying something terrible must have happened. I opened the door to find this huge man I'd known all my life, now sobbing like a child, repeating, "Jesus, what did you do?" and call an ambulance. I grabbed the cordless phone, dialed 999, and told them the address, explaining something was very wrong, though I didn't know exactly what. I sprinted to the neighbor's house, my mom and the brother-in-law trailing behind. At the top of the stairs, I turned right and saw him, this man who had always been kind to me, sneaking me crisps, letting me sip his beer during football games. He had collapsed awkwardly between the bed and bedside table, one arm stretched up the wall, towel slipped, slippers fallen. He was a tall, heavy man, and when I rolled him over, I knew he was gone. The signs were there, lividity pooling purple along one side, tongue swollen, eyes void and lifeless. I covered him quickly for dignity as my mom came in and screamed, dropping the phone. I picked it up, reporting to the operator. No pulse, lividity present, he was gone. The dispatcher still insisted I start CPR. My mom and the brother-in-law were too distraught to help, so I did it myself, following the rhythm out loud. I hated every second of it, using his nose because his swollen tongue blocked his mouth. But I kept going. At one point, I thought I saw movement in his eyes, and I pushed harder, convinced maybe I could save him. By the time paramedics arrived, I was exhausted, arms shaking, barely able to breathe myself. I flagged them down, relaying everything as they hooked up an ECG. The room went silent. The machine showed nothing. They shook their heads. I broke the news to my mom and the brother-in-law, who collapsed with grief. Then I had to make the hardest call of my life, phoning his sister to tell her she needed to come home immediately. She screamed when I told her he was dead. A raw, primal scream I will never forget. Police arrived, treating it as a suspicious death since there was no forced entry. Later, the post-mortem revealed a brain hemorrhage from an aneurysm. The funeral came, and his entire family thanked me for trying, though I felt I had failed. Even now, I still see his eyes in my nightmares. Rest in peace, Uncle C. Story 29. It was the summer of 2001, and I was 18 years old. I was upstairs in my room with my girlfriend when I heard what I thought was a car racing down our semi-busy street. That wasn't unusual, so I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I found my 8-year-old sister crying in the living room. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she couldn't find our mom. Just then, my girlfriend came downstairs and told me she had suddenly felt dizzy. In that moment, everything connected in my head. I ran to the garage and flung the manual door open. There was my mom, unconscious, slumped beside one of our cars with the door open. The sound I'd heard earlier was the engine. She had tried to take her own life with carbon monoxide. Thankfully, her survival instincts had made her open the door and pull herself partly out. She clutched a rag to her face, but she was breathing strangely and unresponsive. I pulled her fully out of the garage, laid her on her back, and tilted her head to the side in case she vomited. I told my girlfriend, who was sobbing, to watch her and make sure her head stayed turned. Then I ran inside to grab the cordless phone. As I did, the carbon monoxide detector went off in the kitchen near the basement door. That explained my girlfriend's dizziness. The fumes had seeped into the house. I grabbed my sister and hurried her outside while I dialed 911. I suddenly remembered our 3 cats were still inside, so I held my breath, ran back in, and carried them all out. Then I made another trip to throw open windows and try to clear the air. It wasn't smart, but I felt I had to. The garage had an old lower rear entrance that must have allowed fumes to leak through the entire house. By the time I returned outside, my knees were buckling, not sure if from fumes, stress, or adrenaline. Moments later, my dad arrived home just as the paramedics pulled in. I explained everything quickly, and he rode with my mom in the ambulance. Miraculously, she survived. She was treated at the hospital, then had a mandatory stay in a psychiatric ward. That night, she called me to apologize. She said the back of her head hurt, which was probably from how quickly I had laid her down, though it caused no lasting harm. In the years that followed, she overcame her drinking problem, which had contributed to her attempt. Nothing that frightening has happened in our family since. I like to think I kept my cool that day, but it was still one of the scariest moments of my life. Story 30. I was 9 years old when I watched my dad die right in front of me. We were on a road trip driving through another state. I don't even remember where we were headed. We were on a small 2-lane road with about a 35-mile-per-hour speed limit and came to a stop sign. The crossroad was a larger highway, 1 lane in each direction, with a speed limit of 55 or 65 miles per hour. Because trees lined both sides, it looked like an ordinary residential street to us. I guess my dad either didn't see the cars coming or thought they also had a stop sign. He pulled out, and a large box truck traveling east slammed into his driver's side door at full speed. At the same time, a smaller sedan traveling westbound hit behind my passenger door, just missing me. Our station wagon spun violently before it finally stopped. I realized I was mostly unhurt, so I turned to look at my dad. Blood ran from his nose and mouth. He was still conscious, moaning softly, his eyes rolling toward me, but he couldn't speak. Before I could process anything, the driver of the box truck ran over and pulled me from the car. Adults gathered quickly and kept me away as I begged to know what was happening to my dad. At the hospital later, nobody would tell me anything until my mom arrived, about 2 hours later. In my naive mind, I thought that meant my dad was going to be okay. But when my mom and a nurse walked in together, both in tears, I knew. My dad hadn't survived. Story 31. I was 17, visiting family in the Dominican Republic, riding in a car with my cousins. John, who was about 20, was driving. I was in the passenger seat, and our 2 female cousins were in the back. We were heading to our grandmother's house late at night for dinner. In the Dominican Republic, power outages are common. They happen so often that most people barely react to them anymore. But I never got used to the absolute pitch black that comes when all the lights go out. The street lamps, the gas stations, the buildings, everything. That night, as we drove down a main road lined with buildings and pedestrian overpasses, the power suddenly went out. The only light left was from our headlights cutting through the drizzle. I tensed up, nervous, but my cousins stayed calm. John hardly slowed down. Then out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow darting across the road. I yelped, thinking it was a dog, but in the next moment everything slowed into horrifying detail. John slammed on the brakes and flipped on the high beams. To my brief relief, it wasn't a dog. It was a man, maybe 50 years old, staggering into the road with his pants slipping down. In that split second, we struck him. His head slammed into the windshield, glass shattering, metal crunching, tires screeching. For a second, there was only silence, broken by the sickening thud of his body hitting the roof, then rolling onto the asphalt. I froze. My brain couldn't process it. All I could think was, what just happened? Why is there so much blood? John leapt from the car, yelling my name, demanding I help him. I don't even remember how I crossed the street, only the image of the man's legs bent at impossible angles as we dragged him onto the sidewalk. He wasn't moving, only coughing blood. My female cousin sat silently in the car, shocked. John called the police and ambulance while we stood there in the darkness. Then, as if mocking us, the power suddenly came back on. Bright light flooded the street, exposing everything. The man's broken body, the blood, the gathering crowd. Neighbors swarmed out of buildings. Rumors spread that his family was on the way. Armed police arrived, handcuffed us, and escorted us out while locals began rifling through the car, stealing whatever they could. As we were taken away, I looked back and saw the man lying motionless in a pool of blood, and the guilt hit me like a wave. We killed him. Later we learned he had survived, but he would never walk again. He had been drunk, stumbling into the street. The police didn't charge us but warned us that in that area we were lucky not to be attacked by his family. They told us next time not to stop. It's been over a decade, but every time it rains I remember that night. I still can't look John in the eyes without seeing it all over again. Story 32. I was 16 when it happened. I live in a nice neighborhood, the kind of place where crime hardly ever happens. One summer night, around 11, I went out to the garage to grab something from the freezer. The garage is set back about 30 yards down the driveway behind the house, and the door was open because I had just gotten home. As I stepped inside, I heard footsteps. I spun around and froze. Standing about 15 feet away was a huge man, easily 6'5", someone I had never seen before. He just stared at me, expressionless, and for a moment I couldn't move. I bolted into the house, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Almost immediately, he began pounding on the door, demanding a little love. My heart was racing. I shut the garage door from inside the house, assuming he would run out before being trapped. But I never heard the motion sensor trip. That terrified me even more. He was still inside. I called the police while running to wake my parents. The banging continued, loud and relentless. Something about knowing he was trapped in the garage, right on the other side of the door, made my skin crawl. My parents and I waited outside on the front lawn, hoping the police would arrive quickly. When they did, they arrested him on the spot. That's when we learned he hadn't just been pounding on the door. He had been stabbing at it with a pocket knife, trying to get inside. The police also told us he was a suspect in several recent break-ins around the area. That night changed everything for me. My neighborhood no longer felt safe, and I couldn't shake the thought that if I had been a little slower locking that door, or if I hadn't heard those footsteps in time, things could have ended very differently. Story 33. I was about 12 years old, living in suburban Massachusetts, roughly 40 minutes south of Boston. By far the most scarring thing I've ever witnessed was watching a man overdose and die in my own front yard. My older sister had serious drug problems and was in and out of rehab for 3 or 4 years. She was arrested multiple times and constantly in trouble. One morning I woke up to her and my parents arguing downstairs. She and a friend had slept in her car in the driveway, and my parents had found them in the morning surrounded by pills. While she was inside yelling at my parents, her friend decided to take more. Moments later, we heard her scream. We rushed outside and saw her friend on the ground in the front yard, foaming at the mouth and convulsing violently. My parents called an ambulance immediately, but by the time the paramedics arrived, he was pronounced dead. I'll never forget standing there as a kid, watching someone in their 20s take their last breaths. You can actually see it happen, the light fading from their eyes. That image burned into my memory forever. I never found out exactly what he had taken, but I do know that morning scarred me more deeply than anything else. I'll never forget his face. It was the moment I learned firsthand what drugs can do, and it's the reason I've never touched hard drugs myself. That sight was more than enough to keep me away. Story 34. This happened just a few months ago while I was working at a pizza shop. There was a guy there named Oscar, a short Italian guy, about 5'5" and 140 pounds. He made amazing pizza and always joked with me when he saw me drinking energy drinks, saying he had never tried one. So being the kind of jerk who thinks he's funny, I brought him one of those NOS bottles, the big plastic ones. Oscar downed the whole thing in 10 minutes, and he was bouncing off the walls. He ran around the shop acting wild while my buddy Greg was at the register. Oscar darted down the prep hallway, jumped around a corner, and then we heard a loud crash. We froze, staring down the hall. Seconds later, Oscar stumbled back toward us, blood pouring from his head. He had jumped up, smacked his skull on the sharp corner of a wooden shelf, then fallen to the ground hard. Because he wasn't wearing non-slip work shoes, his feet gave out and his head slammed against the floor. When I looked at him closely, I nearly fainted. He was literally holding part of his scalp in his hands, his head split open like a cracked egg. "I need to go to the hospital," he shouted. He was bleeding so heavily that I threw him into my car. Halfway to the ER, he passed out, so I was running red lights, steering with my knee, shifting gears with one hand while pressing his scalp back against his skull with the other. I've never seen so much blood in my life. He ended up needing emergency surgery and over 200 staples running from his eyebrow to the back of his head. It was insane. I've always thought of myself as someone with a strong stomach, but that moment was beyond anything I had ever seen before.